Hello, this is again Dr. Jehonathan Bentwich, and I'm here. It's a very actually exciting day today because it's the birth date of one of the fifth rabbi of the Milubavitch rabbis, Rabbi Rashab, and I'm recording for this special day. I'm recording another important video associated with this new God's Physics book that I've written, which has been published by iUniverse, and that this book is actually detailing or outlining the topic of today's video presentation is the new scientific revolution of God's physics for 21st century theoretical 21st century theoretical physics. So this scientific revolution that is taking place in physics and theoretical physics for this century, for 21st century, is brought about by this God's physics. I've written this book again for the general public, laymen as scientists alike, and so the topic of today's presentation is the new scientific revolution of 21st century physics, theoretical physics, brought about by God's physics. As I mentioned earlier, God's physics, there's been over 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles published about this breakthrough, about this new paradigm in science. There's been two now, a third special issue is just about to come out. This book itself has been presented across the globe. It's being translated now also in South America, in Israel. But today's presentation or talk is very important, and it's obviously, according to this theory and according to Hasidic thought as well, nothing in the universe happens by chance. In Hasidic thought, it's called personal providence. In this theory, which I'm going to discuss or talk about, the scientific revolution of 21st century theoretical physics brought about by God's physics new paradigm. So in this theory as well, the whole universe is being created and recreated so many billions or even trillions of times per second by this singular higher ordered reality, this universal consciousness reality or universal computational / consciousness principle. But let me begin by just pointing out the fact, and I've presented this again as a keynote opening lecture of multiple conferences. I've just delivered such a keynote opening lecture in Aerospace 2021 in Paris and many other conferences. So I would like to first just again highlight the fact that science evolves by leaps and bounds. Science is not a static endeavor, and it always evolves. Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher of science, published back in 1962 an influential book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he was actually highlighting the fact that science evolves by transitioning from one paradigm to another paradigm. So he gave the example, and I've spoken about this. For example, before Einstein's revolution of relativity theory about 100 years ago, Einstein's relativity theory was verified empirically in 1919 when Eddington conducted a measurement of the accelerated rate. Of the double valued perihelion pathway of Mercury around the Sun, and that actually validated Einstein's critical prediction. And then relativity theory, which replaced or expanded actually the older paradigm, which was Newtonian mechanics, classical mechanics of 19th century physics, that transition, and there was a leap, there was a revolution from the older paradigm of classical mechanics of Newton, Isaac Newton, to the new paradigm of 20th century, the last century, relativity theory, and then quantum mechanics. So Thomas Kuhn was teaching us how science evolves, and science is not a static endeavor. In a sense, that's what Thomas Kuhn has taught us, that science evolves through a certain paradigm, let's say 19th century Newtonian mechanics, was good enough for a while. But then after a while it became too constrictive. It couldn't explain certain phenomena, and then there was a need for a paradigmatic shift, for a revolution in science. And that's what Einstein brought about. And that's essentially what's happening right now. So I just want to highlight the fact that for the past 100 years, actually, in around the time that Einstein's general relativity theory was accepted in 1919, and even before that, Einstein considered one of the two greatest geniuses science has ever known, him and Isaac Newton, actually. So Einstein started seeking what he called the unifying field theory, and my theory, the God's physics theory, was earlier called also in honor of his quest, his historic quest, was also called the computational unified field theory. But Einstein essentially was dissatisfied, and he sensed in his genius, he sensed that a situation such as the one that the crisis that we find ourselves in at the turn of 21st century, the crisis, the paradigmatic crisis, the impossible situation of science, where the two major pillars of the old paradigm of which I call the material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, the two pillars, so to speak, of that old paradigm seem to contradict each other, because relativity theory speaks about a strict speed of light barrier for the transmission of any signal across space and time, and quantum mechanics, especially with the quantum entanglement phenomenon, has proven that there are certain phenomena such as the quantum entanglement phenomena, where a measurement of one entangled particle instantaneously seemingly affects a particle that would be separated by a greater distance that can be traversed by the speed of light. So we have a contradiction which Einstein, the great Einstein, was trying to resolve through the quest for a unifying field theory. We have a basic contradiction between relativity theory about the macroscopic universe and quantum mechanics about the microscopic subatomic realm. And that contradiction, which Einstein was trying to resolve through his seeking and quest for a unifying field theory, and actually there's some evidence that even on his deathbed he was still scribbling equations trying to discover this unifying field theory. So science is, in a sense, in a state of crisis or paradigmatic crisis for the past 100 years. It's become worse, actually, over the last 20 years. Since we know that the universe is expanding, and it's expanding actually at an accelerated rate. Imagine, for the layman, imagine that you have a balloon filled with air or oxygen, and that balloon is actually now being expanded at an accelerated rate, meaning maybe at the beginning it's 1 gallon per minute, and then it's 2 gallons, and then it's 3 gallons. So it's expanding at an accelerated rate. And that problem of the accelerated expansion of the universe has become a major problem for 21st theoretical physics, because the way that the old material causal paradigm, and specifically general relativity theory, can account for this, or can try to account for this accelerated rate of expansion, is through purely hypothetical dark matter and dark energy concepts. And I'm saying that the situation, the crisis, this paradigmatic crisis, become worse because not only, as Einstein has noticed and tried to seek that unifying field theory to resolve the apparent contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, but over the last 20 years, this dark matter and dark energy, which is now assumed to comprise up to 95% of all the matter and all the mass and energy in the universe, that dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts have failed to be detected over the past 2 decades. A lot of experimentations have taken place, and these purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, which again right now they're a major problem because they're supposed to account for up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, and yet they cannot be detected. By the way, just to highlight this crisis, Scientific American, one of the last issues, had a major article, and the title was "The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy." So, meaning that after 2 decades of intensive search for this purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, which, it's an impossible situation. They're supposed to account for 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, yet they cannot be detected. So therefore, Scientific American also acknowledged that fact. And even though there's still searches for that dark matter, dark energy concepts, still it's becoming clearer and clearer that those purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, they may not stand. They're a major problem. So that just highlights and intensifies the crisis, the paradigmatic crisis of the old paradigm, the material causal paradigm. Now, for the general public, maybe I'll just explain briefly why I've, over these 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, books that have been published, including the recent God's Physics, book which I strongly recommend to the general public. I wrote it for the layman readers, and keynote opening talks. So I want to explain why, give a sense to the listeners, to the audience, why I call this old paradigm the material causal paradigm. So the basic, because that would help us to understand what's the crisis, what's the new paradigm, and what's this amazing scientific revolution that's taking place now as we speak, with this new God's Physics paradigm, which is considered and being accepted more and more as the new satisfactory scientific paradigm for 21st century physics and science more generally. So the old paradigm, the material causal paradigm, the reason that I called it the material causal paradigm is because the old paradigm has a basic material causal assumption, both in relativity theory and in quantum mechanics. And that assumption essentially is saying that any phenomena or phenomenon in the universe, whether it's a relativistic macroscopic phenomena about the stars, the galaxies, etc., whether it's a microscopic phenomena about the subatomic particles and the standard model, etc. So in both cases, there is a basic material causal assumption, and that means that the basic assumption, material causal assumption, assumes that any phenomena or phenomenon in the universe can be explained strictly by cause and effect interactions between X and Y or more elements. So any phenomena in the universe is assumed to be explained by this direct physical material causal interaction. To give you two glaring examples, so general relativity theory assumes that the universe was created by an initial nuclear event, the Big Bang model, and that Big Bang nuclear event or hypothesized nuclear event that has created then, again, cause and effect, nuclear event creating all the matter, energy, space, time, planets, stars, galaxies, etc. Cause and effect. And also, by the way, relativity theory, general relativity theory, with this purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy that's been added, in a sense, on the basis of the general relativity theory, assumes that it's dark matter, dark energy, again, non-detectable and highly hypothetical. And I've called actually to cancel and discard dark matter, dark energy, because if you cannot find them after 2 decades of intensive search, and for other theoretical reasons, there's some articles that's coming out, and there's been a few articles that I've published about discarding dark matter and dark energy as superfluous concepts, just as Einstein, by the way, discarded the ether concept, which was also assumed to exist in Newtonian mechanics and assumed to perfuse the whole universe, and yet back then as well, so many numerous experiments, including the Michelson-Morley famous experiment were conducted, and the ether concept could not be detected. And so the great Einstein said, well, if it cannot be detected, it has to be discarded, superfluous. And I've done the same thing. I believe it's the same case. So in any event, what I'm saying is that also the expansion of the universe, the accelerated expansion of the universe, even though, again, it's very problematic and dark matter, dark energy cannot be detected and they have to be discarded, but nevertheless, according to the old material causal paradigm, the assumption is that these purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts are pushing and propelling the universe to expand at an accelerated rate. Again, cause and effect based on Einstein's equations, etc. So that's at the macroscopic realm. In the microscopic realm of quantum mechanics, we have the same material causal assumption. So it's also part of this material causal paradigm. Excuse me. So it's the same material causal assumption. Why? Because in quantum mechanics also there is the assumption that when you have the subatomic probe element, which is then impacting the subatomic assumed target's probability wave function, when that interaction takes place, the dispersion of the subatomic target along the probability wave function collapses into a singular complementary space, energy, time, mass value. So that's again cause and effect. The target's assumed probability wave function exists, the probe element exists. When they interact, that causes, quote unquote, the collapse of the target's probability wave function into a single complementary space, energy, time, mass value. So that's cause and effect, material causality or material causal assumption. That's the old paradigm. And again, in all the lectures that I've put online, in many of the keynote opening lectures, in the books actually, and in the 60 plus peer-reviewed articles, I've essentially outlined the fact that, and I've done this also now in this presentation, briefly of course, that the old material causal paradigm simply has reached a dead end and it reached a paradigmatic crisis state. And according to Thomas Kuhn, and according to our experience with relativity theory that's replaced Newtonian mechanics, etc., that means that when the old paradigm, in this case the old material causal paradigm, assuming that everything in the universe takes place as a cause and effect interaction and can be explained as a cause and effect interaction, like the Big Bang being caused by a nuclear event, like the expansion of the universe, accelerated expansion of the universe, being caused by dark matter, dark energy, again purely hypothetical, and I believe they have to be discarded. That's what the New Gods physics is telling us. Microscopic scale, the collapse of the probability wave function, assumed to be caused by the direct interaction between the subatomic probe and the subatomic target's probability wave function. So that old paradigm has reached a paradigmatic crisis. It cannot explain where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exists. There's a contradiction, a basic contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, as I just outlined. And so Thomas Kuhn is telling us, and that's what happened 100 years ago, that's the point where the old paradigm has to be expanded. It doesn't work any longer. And how does it have to be expanded? If you find a new theory, such as God's physics paradigm, considered as the new paradigm for 21st century physics, theoretical physics, if you find a new paradigm that can resolve the apparent inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and also offer an external alternative satisfactory explanation, testable explanation for this accelerated expansion of the universe, and moreover, if you find at least one critical prediction that differentiates between the new God's physics paradigm and the old material causal paradigm, just as when Einstein had a critical prediction, he said, okay, let's test the difference. Let's see which theory is more valid. Relativity theory, general relativity theory, or Newtonian mechanics. And he found a critical prediction. I just alluded to that at the beginning of this conversation, this talk, that he identified a critical prediction, which essentially was the solar eclipse measurement happened in 1919. But anyway, the measurement of Mercury's perihelion pathway curvature around the sun. According to general relativity theory, the value was predicted to be 1.6 as opposed to 0.8 by Newtonian mechanics due to the curvature of space-time by massive objects such as the sun. But the point I'm trying to make is that in order to move on and make the leap, advance, in order for science to advance from the old paradigm of Newtonian mechanics of 19th century to the new paradigm or newer paradigm, now it's the old paradigm obviously, but back then at the turn of the 20th century in 1905 and 1915, with special relativity, general relativity, 1919, the empirical validation of Einstein's critical prediction was carried out by Eddington. And when Eddington actually verified that the Mercury's perihelion pathway around the sun is double valued in its curvature, 1.6 as opposed to 0.8, that's the point where general relativity theory was accepted. And lo and behold, and that's again something that Thomas Kuhn is alluding to, that the older paradigm of Newtonian mechanics became a special case in the newer paradigm of 20th century general relativity theory. By the way, encouraging for us and very remarkable about this great genius of Einstein, who's not just a great genius, he was very humble. And when he was asked about 100 years ago, what would be your prediction or your sense of relativity theory? The general relativity theory, by the way, considered as the greatest intellectual achievement that any one single human being has achieved. So he was asked, what do you think would be the fate of your general relativity theory in 100 years? Would it stand forever? And Einstein said, in a humble and very in a humble way, essentially, he was saying, innocent way, he was saying, well, I do not believe that general relativity theory will hold forever as valid. I just hope for general relativity theory to become a special case within a broader generalization. And that's exactly what happened with Newtonian mechanics, which became a special case within general relativity theory. And that's exactly what's happening, by the way, with both quantum mechanics and relativity theory becoming, in a sense, integral parts, or in a sense, special cases or special features within this broader new paradigm of God's physics for 21st century physics. So I think what we've understood so far is A, that science is undergoing a paradigmatic crisis and a paradigmatic shift towards from the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics to the new paradigm, new 21st century paradigm of God's physics. That's the paradigmatic shift that's taking place. Now, because today's topic is this scientific revolution that's taking place in science, I would just highlight maybe a few minor points and then focus on this scientific revolution and explaining it in general terms, because it's quite amazing what it does in science and what the ramifications for humanity are quite remarkable. So just to highlight, the same way that we quoted and we stated that for a paradigmatic shift to be accepted by science, by scientists, to make this leap now from the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics to the new paradigm, 21st century paradigm of theoretical physics of God's physics, to do that, science needs to verify or validate at least one critical prediction in which the new paradigm's prediction, critical prediction, is different than the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics predictions. And that, once we find such a case, like Mercury's perihelion curvature around the sun, once we find such a prediction and once we can validate such a prediction, then essentially this is a validation, this is a direct validation and acceptance of the scientific community and of science in general for this new paradigm. So I want to highlight, again, there's been multiple articles written about this. Some initial direct validation for this new God's physics paradigm has already taken place. And I've called, and I'm still calling, for cosmologists, astronomers, experimental physicists working in subatomic accelerators to continue and validate further validations. But the basic validation has already taken place. And I'm just going to highlight that. Again, multiple articles have been published about this, and now another third special issue is going to come out with some further indications for this validation. Very briefly, because it's a detailed subject, the two initial validations, one clear validation, another partial validation of critical predictions of this new God's physics have taken place. So the first one is, since I think that this is the time to explain very briefly the leap and the discovery, the major discovery made by God's physics. Obviously, there's multiple theoretical postulates, very elaborate, but I'm going to just highlight the core so that perhaps it's going to be much more understandable and comprehensible, these critical predictions. And then we're going to continue to highlighting the scientific revolution that's taking place and the significance of this scientific revolution of this new paradigm for 21st century physics, God's physics paradigm, or the computational unified field theory, as I called it previously. So God's physics resolution and major discovery, resolution of the apparent contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which is the crisis of the old paradigm, material causal paradigm. The way that the new God's physics paradigm was able and is able to essentially resolve this apparent contradiction and also explain this accelerated rate of the universe's expansion is through its remarkable discovery of a singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. And that UCP, universal computational / consciousness principle, is assumed or postulated to compute every pixel, every small point, minimal point in the universe. So it's computing all simultaneously, all the pixels, all the points in the universe simultaneously at an incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, which gives us an approximate value of 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second. So many trillions of times per second, the new God's physics paradigm discovered and is postulating that this UCP computes simultaneously a series of extremely rapid series of frames, universal frames. So each frame of the whole universe, three-dimensional frame of the whole universe computed simultaneously, and for a trillionth of a trillionth, etc., of a second. And then after this frame, this universal frame, the universal frame of the whole universe, existence of the whole universe is computed, it exists for a trillionth of a trillionth, etc., of a second, so minus 50 zeros, many trillions of times per second, and then it dissolves back into this UCP. And then the UCP computes another frame, a subsequent frame, which is more expanded. That's alluding, by the way, to the new explanation of the accelerated expansion of the universe. But in any event, the discovery of the remarkable discovery of this new God's physics paradigm is that the universe is not static. It's being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved many trillions of times per second by this universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. So this major discovery, by the way, that's the reason that this UCP is called, the new paradigm is called the God's physics acausal computational paradigm, acausal computation paradigm, because this acausal computational paradigm essentially says that because the UCP is computing simultaneously each frame, and then the whole universe is dissolving to the UCP, and then again computing simultaneously the whole universe as a frame, there cannot be any cause and effect. Remember, the material causal paradigm assumed that everything operates by cause and effect. The Big Bang as caused by the nuclear event, etc. The collapse of the probability wave function is caused by its direct interaction with the subatomic target. But that's not the case. The new paradigm is an acausal computational paradigm, acausal computation paradigm, which essentially says there cannot be any cause and effect. There cannot be any direct or even indirect physical interactions existing either in one frame, because all the pixels are computed simultaneously, or between one frame and another frame, because in between them we have a dissolution of the whole universe back to the UCP, and so there cannot be any cause and effect between them. So that's why this new acausal computational paradigm is transforming science. There's no cause and effect, material cause and effect. There is an organization of these series, extremely rapid series of frames, by creation and organization and evolution of these frames by this singular universal consciousness principle, or UCP. Excuse me. So we find that this new paradigm essentially replaces the old material causal paradigm with a new acausal computational paradigm. Now, again, without getting into all the intricacies of this elaborate and beautiful theory, but what I am going to say is that this UCP for each pixel computes simultaneously its four basic physical features of space, space, energy, mass, and time. And it does so based on three, actually two more involved computational dimensions of framework, whether the computation is carried out relative to the whole frame. That's for space and energy. The degree of change of an object from one frame to another would give us the energy value. The consistency of any object relative to the whole frame across a series of frames will give us the space value. Again, very elaborate, but the basic idea is that the UCP would compute simultaneously for each exhaustive spatial pixel the space energy, which is for the frame consistent or inconsistent computation, and then object consistent or inconsistent, which would give object consistent, would give mass value, object inconsistent would give time value. So the UCP is computing for each pixel in the universe simultaneously the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. And by the way, at the heart of this universal, of this new God's physics paradigm, there is, it also appears, by the way, at the bottom of this book, this elegant book. Here we have the universal computational formula. So there is a universal computational formula that actually unifies between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, resolves their basic differences, integrates them as secondary computational features of this universal computational formula. This universal computational formula essentially tells us that the UCP is computing simultaneously every point in the universe simultaneously, and for every point the four basic physical features of space, energy, time, mass, and time. And it also integrates for the first time in physics these four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. I'll talk about it perhaps, and I've spoken about this. What I wanted to highlight is that there is already an initial validation for this new God's for a specific critical prediction of this new God's physics paradigm, and that initial validation of a critical prediction of God's physics paradigm, just as Eddington verified Einstein's Mercury perihelion double-valued pathway. There is now an initial validation already with what is called the proton radius puzzle, and that's a phenomena discovered back in 2010. Until this date, multiple experiments were not able to resolve this puzzle, the proton radius puzzle. But in fact, and I'm going to explain it very briefly, but in fact, this proton radius puzzle findings, associated findings, is almost precisely validating one of the critical predictions of this God's physics new paradigm. And so just to explain it very briefly, since the new God's physics paradigm explains and portrays, defines mass, mass, time, space, and energy as we said, as computational measurements or computational values of this UCP and the universal computational formula. So according to that new definition, computational definitions of God's physics through the universal computational formula, of the way that the UCP can compute the mass value, the time value, the energy value, the space value, through the new definition of these four basic physical features, this new God's physics paradigm is essentially teaching us that that we have that the proton radius puzzle is being explained in a different way. And that a new explanation of the proton radius puzzle, according to God's physics paradigm, the proton radius puzzle essentially says that when you have a hydrogen atom that is surrounded by an electron, that's a standard hydrogen atom, and when you replace that hydrogen atom with the electron with a muon, which is a more massive particle relative to the electron, when you compare these two states or situations, you get a puzzle, you get a phenomenon where the muon replaced hydrogen atom the proton of that hydrogen atom decreases in its radius relative to the equivalent radius of the proton for the hydrogen atom, which is surrounded, the standard hydrogen atom, which is surrounded by an electron. And that's a puzzle. In other words, it cannot be explained. It failed to be explained, even though there is numerous experiments and different hypothetical accounts. But really, it's still a puzzle. It cannot really be explained by quantum mechanics or relativity theory. In contrast, the new God's physics paradigm actually has a prediction which has predicted this proton radius puzzle findings, because according to the new prediction of God's physics paradigm, the mass of a particle or of an object, a relativistic object, would be computed based on the number of consistent presentations of that particle composition across a series of frames. And what that means is that when you have a more massive particle, such as a muon, it would be what I term more spatially consistent. So it would actually be measured as more accurate and more and smaller in its diameter. In this case, the proton radius encircled and affected by the muon, relative to the proton, which is affected and circulated by the electron. So with a muon, which is much more massive, in a sense, brings about or is computed, and the proton associated with the muon is computed by the UCP as much more spatially consistent. In other words, this is the first validation, direct validation of God's physics critical prediction relating to the UCP's definition of massive particles or objects, etc. So we actually get a first initial validation. It's been published, it's been lectured as keynote lectures and presentations. But this proton radius puzzle is verifying, validating the predictions, the critical prediction, one of the critical predictions of God's physics paradigm. So we actually have an acceptance of God's physics paradigm as more valid than relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Initial validation for this is through the proton radius puzzle. Another partial validation, it's a validation, but it still would benefit from further experimentation, which I called for cosmologists and astronomers. That second validation, initial partial validation, regards this phenomena of the accelerated expansion of the universe. And remember, we said that the old model, one of the major flaws of the old material causal model, is that it cannot account for this accelerated expansion of the universe, because it assumes that it can be explained by dark matter, dark energy, but those cannot be found. And for other theoretical reasons, it's been discarded. So the new explanation, and actually the new critical prediction, one of the new critical predictions of, of this new God's physics paradigm, is that when we look at the specific, what I call collective human consciousness focus intervals, such as the Jewish Rosh Hashanah 2 days time interval, in which millions of Jews, in this case, focus on this universal consciousness reality. In religious terms, we would call it God. But whenever you have this collective human consciousness of a large group of individuals, human beings, whenever there is this collective human consciousness focus on this universal consciousness reality, or UCP, then according to this new God's physics paradigm, the UCP, or the universal consciousness reality, would initiate a non-continuous expansion or acceleration, a non-continuous acceleration in the rate of the universe's acceleration rate. So in other words, in the new God's physics paradigm, if we find, a critical prediction is, if we find that the rate of the acceleration of the universe does not remain constant, meaning there is a leap, there is a non-continuous increase in the rate of acceleration, that's an indication, that's a critical prediction for God's physics paradigm, which is different than the material causal paradigm. There's now in press actually a series of articles talking about the duality principle, which was mentioned earlier as one of the postulates of this new God's physics or computational infinite field theory paradigm. But in any event, and that negates the dark matter, dark energy concepts, purely hypothetical concepts, negates the material causal assumption of general relativity's Einstein's equations, negates the collapse of the probability wave function based on the material causal assumption, etc. But it's again the second initial validation of a critical prediction of God's physics paradigm is the fact that we see that the universe is expanding. The relative acceleration of the universe changes. And so the first indication for that, I've published articles about that. There's a gap between the way the measurement of the acceleration rate of the universe at the beginning or close to the beginning of the assumed the beginning of the universe, the background radiation, the rate at that earlier cosmological measures is significantly smaller than the rate of acceleration of the universe as measured now astronomically, which is higher. And there is a gap there. That gap indicates a non-continuous acceleration rate of the universe. It's not continuous. There is a gap. There is a leap. And obviously, so that indicates that the new God's physics paradigm is more valid again. The critical prediction about the non-continuous increase in the rate of the acceleration of the universe is been corroborated or validated by this gap between astronomical and cosmological measures of the universe's expansion rate. That's an initial validation. I also called, and I'm still calling, I'm still waiting for results to come in. I called astronomers, cosmologists to test specifically and indicate that this non-continuous increase in the universe's expansion rate, accelerated expansion rate, occurs during these collective human consciousness focus intervals. And so I called just recently in September 7th and 8th 2021 during the Rosh Hashanah Jewish year Rosh Hashanah 2 days interval, I called cosmologists, astronomers to measure and see if in fact the critical prediction is that not only it's a non-continuous increase as we see from the gap between the astronomical and cosmological measures of the universe's expansion rate, but specifically, more specifically, I would say, I called astronomers and cosmologists to validate that during these 2 days and subsequently there is a non-continuous increase, incremental increase in the universe's acceleration rate. But in any event, we have now two initial empirical validations of unique critical predictions of God's physics new paradigm, and therefore, because they've been validated both in the proton radius puzzle, critical prediction of God's physics, and also about the non-continuous increase or acceleration rate of the universe as indicated by the cosmological astronomical gap, and as further can be validated by measurements for the collective human consciousness focus. That still remains to be seen, but the initial validation, two indications that this new God's physics paradigm is the new valid satisfactory paradigm for 21st century physics, and it replaces, it embeds, it integrates, and it transcends actually, and in many cases negates some of the elements of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. But in any event, quantum mechanics and relativity theory, the elements of the old material causal paradigm, with some changes obviously, they're being embedded within the new God's physics paradigm as special components or special cases. So now we can reach the highlight of this interesting topic about the new scientific revolution of 21st century physics, theoretical physics, by God's physics new acausal computation paradigm. And so even though it's an elaborate subject, but because I think it's first, as I said, this is a very significant day. It's a holy day for the Jewish people, at least in terms of our respect for this fifth rabbi of the Chabad movement, rabbinical chain, Rabbi Rashab. And so this is significant that the lecture is taking place at this time. By the way, in God's Physics book, I highlighted that there is great resemblance, astonishing resemblance between this new God's Physics paradigm and some of the already known truths and discoveries and profundities of Hasidic and Jewish saints and leaders, etc. But essentially what I'm saying now is that I want to highlight what is the ramifications of this new scientific revolution of God's physics. So we're now entering completely a new era in scientific understanding of the universe, both its origination, its dynamics, its sustenance, its evolution, its ultimate goal, and the special role that we human beings are playing and are expected to play within this drama, within this new paradigm, new acausal computational paradigm of God's physics, new 21st century understanding. So first of all, we understand, based on this new God's physics acausal computational paradigm, that the universe has not been created as a cause and effect by an initial Big Bang nuclear event. It could not have been created in that manner because in the first frame, second frame, third frame, or billionth frame, and much more than that, obviously, until today, but even when we take the first frames of this initially assumed Big Bang nuclear event, in the first frame, there could not have been any interaction between any spatial pixel in that first frame. So there could not have been a creation in the first frame or the second frame of mass, energy, space, time from the interaction from a nuclear event. There cannot be any physical interaction in the first frame between any two or more spatial pixels in the first frame, nor in the second frame. The whole universe dissolves back into the UCP between the first and the second, and then between the second and the third, etc. So this new acausal computational paradigm, which I explained, essentially negates the old material causal assumption that the universe was created by a Big Bang. It challenges and negates the material causal assumption of Einstein's equations at the center of general relativity theory. So the universe was not created, or could not have been created, by an initial nuclear Big Bang event. I give the example, and I want to use it again. If we had a glass bottle, and we had a hammer, and that hammer would hit the glass bottle and cause the rupture or the breakage of the glass bottle, and then the spillage of the water on the table, that's how it seems to our naked eye when we would see a film depicting that crash. But when we slow down the progression of the film, we would see that in the first frame, these two objects are presented simultaneously, second frame simultaneously, third frame, fourth frame. Even when they're touching, they're still presented simultaneously. So because they're presented simultaneously, there cannot be any cause and effect. So what that means is that we're using the cinematic film metaphor to explain that we can have a situation that it seems to the naked eye, or to our naked scientific eye, in a sense, in the old model, material causal paradigm, it seems like there's a cause and effect, as if the hammer has caused the breakage of the glass bottle and the spillage of the water. But really, when we analyze it, we see that the only thing that happened is the producer of the film has arranged a series of frames where the proximity is getting closer and closer, and then the bottle is presented broken, then the water is spilled. It's in a sense an illusion. In other words, the cause and effect relationship are not really existent in the way that we think they exist. What does exist, according to this new acausal computation paradigm, is that the UCP, this universal consciousness principle reality, is arranging the frames, the universal frames, in such an order that it gives us the impression, which is what the old material causal paradigm assumed, that there is a cause and effect. So, to make it clear, the universe was not created by a Big Bang, a nuclear event. The universe is actually being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved many billions of times or trillions of times per second. So the universe was not created by initial Big Bang, nuclear event. It's not evolving based on dark matter, dark energy, which were discarded by the new God's physics paradigm. They cannot be detected after 20 years of experimentation, and there's some, causal computation considerations that lead to the discarding of this dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts. So the universe is not expanding based on Einstein's equations, material causal assumption, as if massive objects curve space and time, and that curvature of space-time then determines the traveling pathways of these massive and less massive objects. Cause and effect cannot take place. What is happening So the universe was not created by an initial nuclear event. It's not evolving based on Einstein's equations, general relativity theories, material causal assumption. It's not as an extension. It's not expanding at an accelerated rate by dark matter, dark energy, which are superfluous. That's an entirely different explanation. What we do see, and that's where it starts becoming very exciting and profound, what we do see is that this universal consciousness principle, or universal conscious reality, actually is the only sole reality behind the universe and transcending the universe. There is two very profound theoretical postulates in this new God's physics paradigm, which I called the computational invariance principle and the universal conscious reality. Again, it's a little bit involved, so I will explain it very briefly. But the idea is that since we see that only the universal consciousness principle, or UCP, exists both during the frames, computing all the spatial pixels for basic physical features of space, energy, time, and mass. So the UCP, or the universal conscious reality, exists both during the frames, and it's computing every pixel in the universe. It's also existing in between the frames, solely without the physical universe, because the physical universe has dissolved back into this universal consciousness reality, or UCP. So the only thing that remains constant, really, the only reality that is constant, is continuous, is uniform, is real in a sense, is this universal computational / consciousness principle. And really we're getting to the understanding that it's a universal consciousness reality that exists both during the frames as producing the physical universe and manifesting as the physical universe, and exists also in between every two consecutive frames without the physical universe. So we contrast the permanency, the constancy of this universal conscious reality, which exists uniformly, continuously, constantly, both when it creates the universe and manifests as the universe during the frames, and also exists without the universe in between the frames. And we oppose that to the physical universe. And the physical universe exists only temporarily, only transiently, phenomenally during the frames, as computed by this UCP, or universal conscious reality, but it dissolves. It doesn't exist in between the frames. So these two profound new computational invariance principle and associated universal conscious reality, they really tell us that there is only one reality. That reality is I call it the universal conscious reality, which exists both during the frames and in between the frames. And that's the only reality. The universe now, lo and behold, is being transformed or metamorphosized into a new understanding. The universe is only an appearance. The universe is only a transient phenomenal manifestation of this singular universal conscious reality. That's an amazing discovery, an amazing realization. So we stop looking at the universe as a static, objective, or solid existence, solid, material entity. It doesn't exist as a material entity. It's been created, dissolved, recreated, evolved, and it's really a manifestation of the only reality, which is this universal conscious reality. Now, the other thing is, I mentioned that's not the topic of today's presentation, but I mentioned it in previous presentation, that one of the profound breakthroughs of this new God's physics paradigm is that, remember, we spoke about the universal consciousness formula. It integrates completely space, time, energy, and mass for the first time in physics. Einstein was able to unify between space and time, energy and mass, E equals mc squared, and the assumed curvature of space-time by massive objects. But it was not complete unification of space, time, energy, and mass, and that is accomplished by this universal computational formula at the heart of this new God's physics paradigm. But beyond that, for the general public, for humanity, for scientists as well, we start looking at the universe in different ways. So the only reality that really exists is this universal consciousness reality. In religious terms, we would call it God. But it doesn't matter how we call it. This universal conscious reality is the only reality that really exists all the time. And the universe is just a transient phenomenal manifestation of this singular soul reality, higher order reality of this universal conscious reality. Some other things that are quite amazing for us, and by the way, when we think about the fact that this universal conscious reality has such an intelligence, has such an infinite intelligence and capacity to compute, remember, dissolve, compute, sustain, and evolve every pixel in the universe simultaneously, many trillions of times per second, that's mind-blowing. We start appreciating the greatness of this universal conscious reality. The other thing is that we've discovered over the last year, we've discovered that this universal computational formula is more elaborate than we thought. This universal computational formula now is called the 10 hierarchical dimensions universal computational formula. And essentially we start looking at, because the physical universe doesn't exist as an objective or material solid reality, it's being created, dissolved, recreated, evolved by this universal conscious reality. And really, as we said, the only reality is this universal conscious reality. So we start investigating science and God's physics, new paradigm, new scientific paradigm for 21st century science and physics. It starts investigating this soul reality, this soul higher ordered reality of this universal conscious reality. And we start understanding that it's typified by 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, including its all goodness property, its dynamic equilibrium moral principle. In other words, because it's all oneness, and what characterizes this universal conscious reality is morality, all goodness. It's striving, actually, morality principle. In other words, it's driving the whole universe towards a perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state, which we call, based on a term derived from Jewish Hasidic thought, it's called Geula. Geula is a perfection, a perfected state in which this universal conscious reality, or God, brings the universe towards the ultimate Geula, perfected state. And that perfected state, we're just at the point, by the way, because God's physics essentially opens the door for this realization, which is the ultimate goal of this universal conscious reality. There is a whole understanding that the universal conscious reality, which is manifesting as the universe and evolving the universe, like the director of the film that created a series of frames with a certain progression, with a certain aim in mind as well. So this universal conscious reality is producing the universe so many trillions of times per second. It's created the universe from its onset as inanimate matter universe, through animate, which is more expansive form of consciousness than inanimate matter. So through animate plants, animals, human beings, and then towards the perfected Geula, ultimate goal state of the universe. So the universal conscious reality is planned, pre-planned, from the initial stages of its manifestation as inanimate matter and inanimate universe, towards the evolution of plants, animals, human beings, and then towards the ultimate goal of this universe, of this universal conscious reality, manifesting and evolving the universe towards the ultimate goal of a perfected Geula state, in which the oneness of this universal conscious reality would be realized. And that oneness is also typified now with these 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, which are also embedded in this new, more expanded 10 hierarchical dimensions computational universal computational formula, essentially telling us that this universal conscious reality is typified by all goodness, by a moral principle, which in a sense allows for the selection of one of multiple possible futures for each human being based on our moral or immoral choices. The universal conscious reality is trying to teach humanity, and each one of us individually, that we're really not separate from this universal conscious reality, and hence not separate from each other. And therefore we cannot act in an immoral manner. If we do, this universal conscious reality selects one of multiple possible futures for every individual human being from its bank, from its reservoir of multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all the past, present, and multiple possible futures, universal frames of the universe. So we get a completely different picture. And by the way, that means that the universe, for us, for humanity, and for us as human beings, we start looking at the universe in a different way. We start realizing, and that's, by the way, a tribute, it's all by personal providence, but that's a tribute to this fifth rabbi of Chabad, the Rebbe Rashab, The Chassidut, Chabad Chassidut, or knowledge or wisdom, is also pointed out that there's only one reality, and that one reality in religious terms, Hasidic terms, is called God. And that reality also in Hasidic terms is leading the universe towards this Geula state, this Geula perfected state. But again, we're speaking now in terms of this new scientific revolution, and we start opening our eyes, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe is calling all of us, human beings, to open our eyes and see the real reality. The real reality is this oneness, which is discovered now by this new scientific paradigm of God's physics. So we're reaching the point that science and this new God's physics paradigm is teaching humanity, and science is more and more accepting and investigating the fact that we're not living in a universe that is material causal. The universe was not created by a Big Bang. It's not being evolved just randomly by interactions between massive objects and space-time, etc., or dark matter, dark energy, which are superfluous and they've been discarded by this new God's physics paradigm. We're actually getting a new perspective of the universe. The universe is a manifestation of the real reality of this universal conscious reality. This universal conscious reality is all goodness, is typified and characterized by all goodness, by morality, by a need and a drive towards the ultimate, evolving the universe from inanimate matter, animate plants, animals, human beings, and towards that ultimate perfected Geula state, which has been pre-planned by this universal conscious reality. So it's a very exciting new universe and a new realization, and that leads us, laymen and scientists alike, to start having a deep sense of awe and respect and appreciation towards this universal conscious reality that is sustaining all of life, that is caring about our moral choices, that is leading the universe towards a perfected, ultimate moral, spiritual, even physical state. Thank you very much.